Hey, Cloudcast community, listen up. Today's show is sponsored by Datadog, a cloud-scale monitoring and analytics platform. Datadog was built to bring clarity to complex, dynamic applications, whether they're in the cloud, on-prem, in containers, or wherever you run your applications. With powerful dashboards, seamless integrations, and more than 250 technologies they can monitor, Datadog has you covered. Whether it's AWS, Azure, or Google services, your popular open source projects and products, or web security and APIs, Datadog can help you monitor them and help you collaborate around troubleshooting them and make sure they're running great. Datadog provides deep end-to-end visibility into the health and performance of modern applications. So, try it yourself. Get yourself a free 14-day trial. Go to datadoghq.com/cloudcast. That's datadoghq.com/cloudcast to try out your free 14-day trial. And if you try it out, let them know your friends at Cloudcast sent you, and they'll send you a great, wonderful, soft, awesome t-shirt with the Datadog logo on it. I wear mine all the time. So once again, that's datadoghq.com/cloudcast. Thanks for listening, and here comes the show.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from the massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is Aaron, just me today. Brian wasn't able to make it this week, but we've got a great guest and a great conversation teed up for everyone today. We have Brad Rudetsky, founder of Drone.io. How are you doing today, Brad?
I'm doing great, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
And first of all, did I get the last name correct?
Close.
I felt like I stumbled a bit when I was going through it.
I've learned to live with that my whole life, so.
Fair enough. So first of all, welcome to the show. Can you share with everyone a little bit about your background?
Sure. Starting with the present, I do open source development full time. I run a project called Drone. It's a continuous integration server that focuses on containers and container workflows. Before that, I spent 10 years doing engineering for a large corporation focused in the financial industry. And before that, I was in school. I majored in business and French, so not technology. But that was in the 90s when everyone was building web pages, and that's kind of how I fell in love with technology, and that jump-started my career.
So from business and French to open source coding.
I know, right?
That's really interesting. But the backstory of Drone is interesting as well, and it's quite timely. Can you share with everyone a little bit about, how it came to be, your
Sure.
thoughts on it all, and kind of the pains that you personally experienced that gave birth to all of this?
Yeah. So I can talk through that in kind of in three little stories. One that'll take us back to, I think, maybe 2005. I was working at a really large corporation, and this was before cloud was really a thing. I think Amazon Web Services was just getting started at the time, but in these days, when we needed infrastructure, we had to open a ticket, and they would send a purchase order to Dell, and you would wait a few months, and that server would end up on your loading dock, and they would that would then sit there for a while until you could get the right person to set it up for you, and then they had to install the software and the patches, and this whole process took like 6 months. And the first time I needed a CI server, I think it took me 8 months to get that procured. By the time it was ready, the project was over. I didn't need it anymore. So that was kind of the start of when I was sitting there thinking like, wow, I wish this was easier. The second little story was a few years later. Again, this was at a big enterprise, and we were a big Java shop, and we were upgrading from, I remember, like JDK4 to JDK5, and it was exciting times because we could use annotations and a whole host of other features. And so we're going to upgrade our Jenkins instances and find out we can't. Well, why not? Because the rest of the organization is not ready to upgrade Java, and we can't upgrade Java on the machine until everyone else is ready. And so, you see that lack of isolation that's a blocker for organizations. And the idea that as a developer, I couldn't control the tools that I was using to get my job done. I had to ask other people, and I was highly dependent on other people in the organization, and it slowed things down. And then the third story comes from just a few years ago. I was actually at a major technology company here in the Bay Area, and I needed a Jenkins plugin installed. Of course, I didn't have the permissions to manage any of my Jenkins jobs or plugins, and I had to open up a ticket, and then I had to go to a Scrum and talk about why I needed it. And then 60 days later, someone finally installed the plugin for me. And again, by then, I really didn't need it anymore. It wasn't as useful to me as when I needed it. And so kind of the broad theme of the pain points that I experienced and led me to want to create Drone was just not being empowered to do my job.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it fits into some of the, larger trends in our industry that we've been talking about on this podcast for a while now. And, of course, you can, you could literally with those stories kind of write the origin story for DevOps. You could write the origin story for CI/CD, right? There's a lot of things that come out of all of that. And everyone likes to talk about, okay, here's all the problems we wanted to solve. But then also I wanted to kind of just explore with you for a little bit here of, okay, what is the current state of that industry today? Like, how far have we really come? Because we hear those stories and, I think that first story went back a good 12, 13 years, but at the same time, we still hear those stories on a regular basis today. And so, give me kind of a, step back for a second. What is your larger thoughts on the progress of the industry and the state of CI/CD tools in the industry today?
Sure. Well, I think we've made a tremendous amount of progress, right? And if you look at a lot of the problems that I was describing and the challenges I faced, whether it was 12 years ago or just a couple years ago, surprise, right? The answer to a lot of those solutions is containers. And I've been incredibly impressed by the speed at which a lot of big companies have adopted containers. It wasn't a trend that, normally I would expect large organizations to take years to adopt these sort of technologies. And especially in the context of CI and CD, we saw them adopt them almost immediately. So I think I was just incredibly surprised at how quickly that happened.
Yeah. And so, and then help me out a little bit with that too. Like in your experience, was that the, containers in general? Was that Docker? Because a lot of people tend to, and we'll get to a little bit of why, Drone and the origins with Docker there a little bit here in a second, but, was it Docker equals containers in your opinion for the longest time? Because it seemed like at a higher level, that's kind of what it was for the industry and how Docker, Big D Docker, the company, rose to such prominence so quickly. But, give us your insight on that.
Absolutely. So actually the original version of Drone, the very first version used LXC containers. And, those worked quite well, but what Docker brought to the table was the ability to easily share images. And I think that was really a game changer. They made the install process, relatively simple and seamless. In fact, the original Docker was built right on top of LXC and just wrapped it with a ton of conveniences. So I think that was a major shift for the industry was the way Docker approached it. And in fact, there were a ton of people doing stuff with containers, and no one really just had the foresight to just think, wow, if we just give people an image repository, that kind of changes everything. So I think that's where Docker really innovated.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. And then to take it one step further, so I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but it was a little bit of like, okay, you saw Docker, you saw containers, you saw the problems you were trying to solve, and so that is the ultimate origin story of Drone, and so Drone is at its heart, if I read about it correctly, it is Go and Docker based as the underlying technologies. Is that a correct statement?
Yes. The lowest level primitive, when you configure your pipeline and your pipeline steps, you're defining them as a series of containers that are being executed. So you could actually think of Drone merely as an orchestration system that just happens to specialize in CI and CD.
Okay. So that's really interesting to me, because now if I kind of take it one step further and say, okay, where does Drone come into play, in this concept of, I read a Newstack article about it, and, they call it one-click build environments, right? So expand a little bit on what that means. How would you fit into, say, an existing pipeline today, and what problems are you trying to solve? Like, help everyone a little bit with taking that theoretical and turning it into practical.
Sure. So, let's touch on one of the major pain points that I faced years ago, which was, I needed to upgrade some software in my CI environment, and I had to open up a ticket to do it. And then I couldn't because, not everyone was using that same version of Java, from that prior example. So let's look at how containers and Drone specifically can solve that. So I'm a developer, and I want to define a pipeline, and I need to use Java or Node. So first of all, I don't have to open a ticket or ask anyone to set up or install anything. I check in a small YAML file right into my GitHub repository, and Drone is going to read that YAML file. And in that YAML file, I'm going to define my pipeline steps as a series of Docker containers. So if I need to use a particular version of Java, I say, okay, for this particular step, I need a Docker image. I need this exact version of Java down to the minor version if I want to. And what happens is when Drone executes your pipeline, it's going to automatically download all of those Docker images on the fly, make sure they're up to date, and then it's going to execute your pipeline steps in those isolated environments. So that solves kind of two major problems that we've faced, in the years past, which is, number one, there's nothing to install. Drone handles all of that. And then number two, your environments are isolated, so different teams can use different technologies or different versions of technologies as they see fit.
And how cross-platform is all of this then? Because I imagine there has to be some kind of, integrations that it has to do at some level, right, to make all of this work. In order to be seamless, it has to have a certain amount of knowledge or intelligence built into it, correct?
Yes. So where Drone has, I think, all of that knowledge and intelligence built in is really interacting with various version control systems. So Drone supports 5 or 6 different source code management systems: GitHub, GitHub Enterprise, GitLab, Bitbucket, Bitbucket Server, GOGS, and a few other open source ones. And so Drone has a ton of intelligence built in so that when you log into Drone, you click one button and say activate my repository, and Drone can go and configure everything with your source code management system automatically, so that every time a developer opens a pull request or pushes code or tags a repository, that Drone can be notified seamlessly of those changes to launch builds. So there's a lot of intelligence there around interacting with the source code management systems.
That makes sense. Okay, perfect. And then, so how are users kind of implementing this today? And what I mean by that is, okay, I get the origin, or like how we're getting the code and we're doing the requests and we're, going down the pipeline. Mm-hmm. Then it kicks it out to something, right? And at the end of the day, it is about code, but it is about how are we using that code, right? So then what happens after it kind of kicks out the back end, if I use that term?
Sure. So, the way it pretty much works is, so if you imagine a pipeline, a developer, might configure it to, right, it's going to clone your code, it's going to run your tests, it might spin up some test containers, to emulate your environment and execute integration tests. And then it might build your binaries, and then maybe it builds and publishes a Docker image, and then maybe it kicks off a step that takes that Docker image and deploys it to Kubernetes as a pod, for example. So I think that would be the ideal output of a standard pipeline, would be building a Docker image and then deploying that to your environment.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And tell everyone a little bit about some of the use cases that you can talk about, because, in kind of doing my research here, there were some pretty interesting use cases and sizes, and a certain amount of, like, when we talk about CI/CD, we're talking about a lot.
Yeah.
And so tell everyone a little bit about the scale, because I found that really interesting, and the kind of the momentum behind it in, like, per day deployments and things like that.
Sure. It's incredible. So, it's a really challenging problem space, because really the requirements for a CI/CD system are virtually unbounded. Everyone wants to do it slightly differently, and you have to handle all these different use cases. So Drone has to be able to scale from a 4-person startup that just wants to run on one server and has maybe simple Heroku deployments to, picture the largest, one of the largest Fortune 50 multinational companies that's using it for thousands of developers that are deploying Kubernetes or building mobile apps. You have to really run the gamut of use cases here. And so it's really taken 5 years to develop Drone and work with all these companies and make sure Drone is flexible enough to handle all these various use cases. In terms of scale, I'm always blown away by how people are using it. There are companies that are using Drone with, thousands of developers in their organization, scaling to hundreds of instances of build machines, and doing there's one company that's doing 10,000 deploys a day with Drone.
Yeah, that's impressive. That's impressive scale, without a doubt. Now, but that, whenever I think about that kind of that size, it immediately comes to my mind of, okay, the operations side of all of this. Like, there's scale up and scale down. There's upgrades. There's security issues. Like, what are kind of some of the thought process and the evolution when it comes to solving those issues and kind of developing and hardening Drone over time? Like, what has been your experience with that?
It's very tedious.
Fair enough.
Yeah, these are, they're all solvable problems, but they can just be very tedious to solve, and you have to really break them down to the core simple problem and start to come up with, here are all the failure points, and you just have to address them one by one over time. And of course, that's been really hard to do with Drone, because we spent kind of 5 years in this beta. We're almost like Gmail, in that we're in this like never-ending beta that's coming to an end here soon. So I think it's focusing on all these failure points and understanding where Drone can fail, where it fails the most often, and how you can build that right into the platform to be more resilient to those failures. So some things we did early on in terms of scaling and failing and failover is we have an autoscaler that we built. So it actually pings your build queue, and as your build queue increases, Drone can automatically provision servers for you. And then as your build queue decreases, maybe towards the end of your workday, Drone can automatically scale those back down. With the added benefit of as Drone is provisioning new servers and recycling servers, you're taking advantage of some automated upgrades. So maybe it's using a newer version of Docker, or maybe it's using a newer minor version of Drone, so that you can benefit from some of the fixes that we're making. And
yep. Go ahead.
The autoscaler can detect anomalies in your build environment. We call them zombie builds. Maybe one of your servers dies and is no longer available, and that build is kind of stuck in this zombie state where it never completed. And so the autoscaler can detect these and try to react to and relaunch. So it's kind of like a very brute force solution to the problem.
Yeah, but that housekeeping sometimes makes all the difference, right? And how do you? Well, and I'm assuming it's an issue. First of all, I'll ask you, is it an issue? And if it is, how do you handle it? But how do you handle that? Almost the concept of multi-location, right? Whether it's AWS on-prem, like if you're, let's just say, for instance, you're deploying to Kubernetes pod.
Sure.
Not a pod may not necessarily always be created equally, right? There's always nuances to the different services or the different platforms, and is that an architectural challenge as well? And what are kind of some of the design considerations there?
Sure. So there's kind of two parts. So in terms of running drone in drone itself, in multiple clouds or hybrid clouds, some of your workloads are in the cloud and on premise. Drone actually does that quite well, just because it uses a more traditional model where you have an agent that talks to a central server to accept workloads. So that agent can sit inside maybe your on-premise cloud, and then you can have agents that are sitting inside, AWS or DigitalOcean or Google or all of the above. In fact, I'm using Drone, I think, across four different clouds right now for my own install. And so Drone actually handles that relatively well. And we've just had to work in some network. The biggest challenge we face there is really just networking, making sure that network disruptions don't cause any issues. So that surprisingly hasn't been incredibly challenging. In terms of the second part to that is how do we support, Kubernetes, or how do we support Kubernetes in multiple availability zones, or how do we support complex deployment requirements from our customers? And the way we've dealt with that is really just the way Drone handles plugins. So, Drone doesn't really dictate how you're going to deploy to Kubernetes. In fact, Drone doesn't even know what Kubernetes is. Drone just knows that it executes a series of container steps. And one of the cool decisions we made really early on was in how we handled plugins, which I think we did in a pretty innovative way, which is that plugins are just Docker containers, reusable logic that you define in your pipeline. So if a company has really complex requirements for deployments, they can actually create their own Drone plugin and bundle all that logic right into a Docker image and share that across their organization, and share those deployment strategies across the organization. And then what we hope they do is that they publish those plugins to GitHub, they publish them to the Docker registry, and then they can share them with the broader Drone community.
Okay. So that's fantastic. Yeah, I really like that. So I think with that, I've been pretty exhaustive with all of the kind of questions I've wanted to ask, because I thought it was just super interesting technology and solving some pretty practical problems today. With that, Brad, where can everyone find out more about you, find out more about Drone? I'm going to put links in the show notes to like GitHub, Twitter, blog, etc. But go ahead and tell everyone where they can find out more information.
Sure. They can find us on GitHub at github.com/drone. They can follow us on Twitter at drone.io, and our website, drone.io.
Fantastic. And with that, that is all the time we have for today. Brad, thank you very much for your time. And on behalf of Brian, who wasn't able to make it, thank you everyone for listening, and we'll talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.